I will get us started. Welcome everyone to our annual How Feminist is the Federal Budget webinar. We've done these a few times now, so it's always great to hear from everyone their take on the budget. My name is Deanna Sorosi. I'm the Director of Policy, Campaigns and Communications at Oxfam Canada. I use pronouns she and her, and I'm today located on the territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. Of course, our speakers are coming from across the country, and so it's really all the territories that we want to acknowledge here today to be able to do our work, be in solidarity with the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples here in Canada. All right. So we'll get started. We're here today as the federal government just released their new federal budget, Canada Strong, yesterday. Of course, it always takes a little while to comb through these 500-page documents, and we've tried our best to do as much as possible of it. But of course, it's hard to really take in everything within the last 12 hours. But what we're really aiming to do is provide a perspective from the women's rights and gender justice sector here in Canada on what's in the budget and what's missing. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our first speaker, Fred Chapeau from Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights.
I'm unable to turn on my camera. I think it has to be you, Deanna.
Okay, I think I just did that. Okay,
Thank you. Thank you so much, Deanna, and I'm so glad to be among all of you to dig into the budget and what this will mean. Budgets are important. They set the stage for what is to come for our country, for our people, for the work that we do. So it's a pleasure to be with so many brilliant minds to be talking about it. So I'm Fred, pronouns she, her. I'm the Executive Director of Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights, which is Canada's Planned Parenthood Federation. And I'm glad to get us launched. And I'll do this by speaking to yesterday and what we got to see yesterday. And about the work that we do. So across this country, feminist and gender justice organizations are woven into the very fabric of our communities. We are the people helping parents find care for their kids. We are the counselors, shelter workers, educators, and nurses and advocates meeting people where they are. We are also the economists, the lawyers, the researchers, the organizers, the policy experts that are working to fix the systems that shape people's daily lives. From emergency hotlines to human rights hearings, from classrooms to Parliament Hill, our sector is the infrastructure that holds this country together. We build the networks for care, trust, and safety that makes it possible for everyone to live a good life, to show up for decent work, to raise families in healthy communities, and to dream bigger than their circumstances. So that's why a little nod to last week's announcement by Minister Valdez, Minister Champagne, and Minister Goldmasti of an investment of $660 million in gender equality that mattered really deeply in how it was framed. It recognized that gender equality work is the work that keeps our communities strong and safe. It invested in the people and organizations who make sure that no one is left to face harm alone, and in those driving systemic change so that one day those harms don't happen at all. It was a moment of recognition for decades of advocacy and for our partnership with government and the importance of gender equality as infrastructural work and as nation building. Now on this budget and what it reveals. So yesterday we got to see this 500-page document, Budget 2025, that the Prime Minister called a generational budget. The problem this government is trying to tackle are real. Canada's productivity has been stagnated. Businesses invest less in technology and innovation than our peers. Infrastructure is aging. Workers are stretched thin. The cost of living and the cost of care makes it hard for people to participate fully in the economy. Next month, we will know if we are in a recession. So the government set out to rebuild the economic foundations of the country, investing in capital and trade competitiveness to get growth and wages moving again. But here's the thing. When you look at what this budget funds, you see the story it's telling about how we build prosperity and who makes it possible. It's a story about structures and systems, but not yet about people. And that's what we'll hear more about today. It strengthens the scaffolding of the economy, but we also need to see what will sustain the human infrastructure that actually makes growth sustainable. The care, health, and equality systems that let workers show up, contribute, and thrive, and for communities to be healthy and well. We know that productivity doesn't come from machines or markets alone. It comes from people who are healthy, educated, cared for, and free to plan their futures. It comes from the very work our sector does every single day and the systems that are built to support that. So let's turn the lens. When we were all meeting yesterday to get into the document, we decided to flip that question around. If a generational budget is meant to shape the next era of prosperity, what would it look like through our lens? It would mean investing in the social and care infrastructure that makes all other progress possible. It would treat gender equality work as nation-building work, as essential to economic renewal, democratic health, and climate resilience. It would recognize that well-being is productivity, that success is not only measured in GDP, that care is infrastructure, and that equality is prosperity. So as we turn to our colleagues today, we'll unpack what this budget means for our sector, what it delivers, what it misses, and what we can build together from here. Because if this is a generational moment, then it's our turn to define what generations we're building for. And we want to build something rooted in care, justice, and collective strength. And with that, I'll be excited to hear what my colleagues have to say. Thank you, Deanna.
Thanks so much, Fred, for kicking us off and framing our conversation today. So with that, I would like to ask Candace to speak.
Great. Thank you so much, Deanna and Fred, for opening us up in a good way. My name is Candace Shaw. I'm the Executive Director at the Ending Sexual Violence Association of Canada. It's a privilege to be here with so many folks around our sector and around our tables who are doing the good work and who I had the privilege of working with throughout the process of understanding what investments look like in our economy and in our current understanding of welfare for Canadians. We at ESPA Canada welcome the investments of stable long-term funding to advance gender equality through Women, Gender and Equality Canada and the federal government's Canada Strong budget for 2025. We do see it as an important recognition and the need to sustain gender equality, gender equity, and gender-based violence initiatives. And this is reflecting the impact of years of collective advocacy across the gender-based violence sector and more recent critical discussions with the Department of Women and Gender Equality Canada and the Women's Caucus. So we have immense gratitude for where those conversations have led us today. Continued funding for WAGE represents a positive step in the right direction towards sustainability, stability, and safety in a time of fiscal restraint. As a generational budget 2025 does leave some critical gaps that raise deep concerns about the future of sexual violence services and gender-based violence supports, and about equity for those who are most impacted by violence. Firstly, there is no mention of sexual violence in the budget, nor any dedicated funding for sexual violence services, prevention, or stability of sexual violence centers and support centers across the country. This omission is particularly troubling given the well-documented and disproportionate impacts of sexual violence on Indigenous and racialized women, newcomers and refugees, and women with disabilities, all of whom already face systemic barriers to safety, justice, and housing. Moreover, there is no reference to the national inquiry into the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and 2S+, or to the urgent need for Indigenous-led GBV responses and full implementation of the calls to justice. Without explicit intentional investment, this budget risks widening existing inequalities and leaving the most marginalized survivors without access to culturally safe and accessible timely supports. While this budget commits to maintaining current bilateral agreements with the provinces and territories under the National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence, it includes no new or renewed funding beyond March 2027. Similarly, there are no mentions of the federal GBV strategy, leaving national coordination and accountability in question. This is especially concerning when we think about GBV at epidemic levels. Investments in sexual and reproductive health and rights are also notably absent, including those related to sexual violence and reproductive coercion. The ongoing funding to WAGE is an important foundation, but it cannot stand alone. Now more than ever, we have to work together. Fiscal responsibility involves key investments and investments in our sector that saves lives and builds public safety. If Budget 2025 is to be truly generational in its impacts, it must invest in these foundations. True community safety and prosperity do not come through prioritizing law enforcement or austerity. They are built through intentional investments in prevention, survivor supports, and social infrastructure that allows communities to thrive and to live free from violence. Thank you. Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Candace. Such an important topic. And so we're going to stay on gender-based violence, and I'll invite Anu to give her remarks.
Hello, everyone.
Yep, we can hear you.
Good. Okay. Can you see me?
I'll start your video.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name's Anuradha Dougal. I'm the Executive Director at Women's Shelters Canada, and I would like to echo Candace's comments about naming the important advocacy that has led to the investments, particularly related to wage, women and gender equality in this current budget. So we were pleased to see that the federal government's 2025 budget announcement last week maintained stable multi-year funding for the Department of Women and Gender Equality. And in this budget, additionally, protecting wage from the broader austerity measures with departmental cuts limited to 2% helps to preserve the critical work that exists right now for advancing gender equity. We also appreciate continued investments addressing housing and violence prevention that aim to address the rise in gender-based violence. However, this budget pays limited attention to the root causes of inequality. We are concerned about the lack of new investments, particularly in childcare, and especially noting that expanding universal childcare supports women's participation in the workforce, strengthens family well-being, and can be life-changing for survivors of domestic violence. Childcare is connected to economic capacity, and Women's Shelters Canada would like to see greater recognition of the link between safety and economic independence for women. Commitments to promote stable jobs and establish a voluntary code to prevent economic abuse are positive steps. However, survivors must have access to comprehensive long-term programs that build financial stability, including jobs addressing women's service areas and the way that women interact with the economic structures, and empower them to create livelihoods that are free from violence. We are encouraged by the $1 million investment in transitional and supportive housing for people experiencing or at risk of homelessness. However, this funding must include a dedicated stream for survivors of gender-based violence and their families and children. Safe, stable, supportive housing is the cornerstone of recovery and independence. The commitment to safety of women, children, and gender diverse people through the 10-year extension of the National Action Plan on Gender-Based Violence recognizes the life-saving work of shelters and service providers and can provide a foundation for a modern system to support survivors. Pandemic-era funding was historic and necessary, and the GBV crisis has not ended with COVID-19. Ongoing sustainable investment remains essential. The announced 223.4 million over 5 years, starting in 26 and 27, and the 44.7 million ongoing for GBV programs is welcome. Yet uncertainty remains about funding beyond 2027. The federal government must stabilize programming in the violence against women sector, the transition house sector, through predictable and adequate funding for community-based organizations. We remain concerned that the plan still overlooks the specific needs of women with disabilities, as well as the populations and groups that Candice mentioned, who are disproportionately affected by violence. Similarly, there continues to be no dedicated funding to address sexual violence, an omission that must be corrected. To ensure accountability and progress, Women's Shelters Canada calls for the creation of an independent federal gender-based violence commissioner to monitor the implementation of the National Action Plan and any future GBV initiatives. There is a demonstration here that there is ongoing attention to gender equity, but it falls short of robust long-term investments that will truly end gender-based violence. We stand ready to collaborate with the federal government to build the next phase of the National Action Plan. We need billions of money to cover this, not millions. This is the generational investment needed to transform Canada into a global leader in gender equality, affordable housing, and ending gender-based violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Anu. I'm going to pass it right over to Messi.
Hi, can you hear me? I think, okay. Okay, so thank you so much for FIG members and all team members for organizing this platform. So my name is Messi. I'm the founder of the Canadian Centre for Women Empowerment. We are the only agency so far exclusively addressing all forms of economic abuse through policy change, research, advocacy, and financial empowerment. So this year, federal budget comes in a very critical moment, as you know, and across the country, women, newcomers, and even survivors who own small business have still navigating the impact of inflation, housing insecurity, systemic barrier, and then full participation to the economy. So on this budget, first time in Canadian history, economic abuse is explicitly mentioned 17 times in the federal budget. This marks a historic policy milestone and a clear acknowledgement that economic abuse is not a private issue, but it's a systemic barrier to gender equality and safety. So this recognition is long overdue, but acknowledgement alone is not enough. Now we must see this understanding to translate in policy implementation, including the National Action Plan, survivor protection, and measurable outcomes that improve the lives of victims. And interestingly, this budget section on expected impact does not yet include the figure for net physical impact, despite the significant impact that economic abuse has on Canadian quality of life. So that's something that CCFWE in the future will be monitoring. So while the budget includes reference to GBA+, but still lack strong intersectional lens, particularly when it comes to Black and racialized and gender diverse community. So this gap is very concerning for us and highlighting the ongoing needs of inclusive feminist economic policy. As you know, just 2 weeks ago, before the budget release, we joined the Minister of Finance and the National Revenue on announcing the voluntary code of conduct on preventions of economic abuse. But still, We'll continue also working with a number of stakeholders to recognize and prevent any economic abuse. And the feminist economic policy, again, must be beyond acknowledgement. We are learning about national action plan. Still, we have a big question with the government. Again, intersectionality is the huge missing part of this budget. And we are also concerned about Build Canada Home Initiative, while it acknowledged the housing affordability crisis, and it's designed linked to immigration rates and the developer-focused support, which is risking leaving behind those most in need, especially for survivors. Of course, we will welcome the 1 billion investment on transitional and support housing for people who are homelessness and risk of homelessness. We'll continue watching closely as advocates, but again, we'll demand funding that must be equitable and help for survivors and vulnerable population. So that's why this year we're mainly focused on advocating, on housing security for survivors. So we also note that the government planned to launch the automatic federal benefit, a measure that could reach 5.5 million low-income Canadians by the 2028 tax year. So if this implemented effectively, this has a potential to remove a key barrier for survivors by simplifying tax filing and ensuring equitable access for income support. For survivors rebuilding after abuse, immediate access to fund benefit is not just financial. It's a matter of safety and recovery. So moving forward, as a feminist organization, we'll continue advocating to have a multi-year funding from wage, targeted investment in safe and affordable housing, meaningful inclusion, marginalized voice, Black, Indigenous, seniors, racialized, disabled, newcomers, and gender diverse folks in policy design and delivery and evaluation. Thank you.
Thank you, Messi, so much. I'm going to hand it straight over to Emily.
Hi, everyone. I am Emily. I work at the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies, and we are an intersectional feminist national organization that works alongside and on behalf of criminalized, incarcerated, and formerly incarcerated women and gender diverse people. There are 22 local Elizabeth Fry Societies who provide essential services in communities across the country. And because of that, I'm going to be speaking specifically on the part of the budget that looks at public safety and so-called justice at the intersection of our women's rights and justice and gender justice. And so just to give you a little bit of framing, this year's federal budget arrived just after the Correctional Investigators Annual Report, which was released on October 30th. And this report releases every year, and the correctional investigator, who is Canada's ombudsperson for our prison, examines the conditions of the prisons across the country. And the annual report this year and in years past underscored the persistent and unacceptable conditions that face people in our prisons, conditions that are actually most dire for women and gender diverse people, and especially Indigenous peoples in this country. Many of you may know this already, but Indigenous women remain 50% of the population of federally incarcerated people in the prisons designated for women. And what this year report makes crystal clear is that nearly all, 100% of the women inside our prisons have experienced some form of trauma in their lives, and that the experience of prison itself is a traumatic environment. And so we juxtaposed this reality as we studied the bones of what was provided to us in the public safety section of Budget 2025. And I say bones because much of the meat of what we were looking for was missing. And when we did that work, what became clear was a misplaced sense of priorities, investing in policing and border control, while evidence-based community supports are ignored at best, and at worst, specific funding pots under public safety for civil society organizations will potentially be sunsetted year over year for the next 5 years. And so this budget describes new spending as necessary to build strong communities. And to quote the budget, our ambitious saving plan means Canadians can count on their government to be more efficient in delivering services that matter while reducing operational costs. And in practice, when it comes to public safety, we see the largest investments are earmarked for traditional policing to the tune of $1.7 billion over 4 years, making good on their commitment to hire 1,000 more RCMP personnel, while at the same time, the much more cost-effective civil society organizations like ours, the ones who have long-standing decades of expertise, networks, and deep knowledge of what it takes to build public safety, are being sidelined, when we should be the partners who are defining Canada's approach to public safety in this moment. And for decades, organizations like CAFES and our member organizations have delivered frontline supports, reintegration programs, trauma-informed advocacy. These are the programs that actually keep people safe, but they are not mentioned in the 2025 public safety section of the budget. And so when the government says that tougher laws are only one part of safer communities, we have to resist the urge to equate public safety with increased policing in our communities. And as we've heard from others today, Budget 2025 makes important and essential commitments to advancing gender equality and investing in women's leadership, economic security, and safety. And we welcome these wholeheartedly, especially the renewed and permanent funding for the Department of Women and Gender Equality and the Women's Program, which are definitely going to help organizations address systemic barriers and hopefully support the full participation of women and gender diverse people in Canadian life. But please do not forget, criminalized women and gender diverse people are some of the most marginalized folks and need to be included in that. And so for progress to be fully realized, it is essential that this work is recognized and resourced by public safety. I'm just going to say that the paradox at the heart of Budget 2025 is that we are saying we need to save money, and yet we are spending billions on organizations like the RCMP and CBSA, and we are forgetting about the most cost-effective ways to implement public safety. A generational budget is one that ensures that investment in communities means working with those who know how to do this work best. And so thank you very much for including that perspective in today's analysis.
Thank you so much, Emily. We're running a little behind, so I'm asking every speaker to please stick to your allotted time. We're going to hand it over to Paula.
Thank you very much, Diana, and everyone. So I will be brief. My name is Paula Caldra, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer with the Canadian Immigrant Women's Association, Canada's largest gender-focused immigrant-serving agency. And we provide holistic support to immigrant and refugee women and girls in the areas of economic integration, social integration, and family resiliency. And I think I can echo a lot of what my former the other presenters are talking about, but ultimately from an immigrant lens and refugee budget 2020 and refugee lens, budget 2025 gives us some of the right tools. So gender equality funding that is not just a one-year pop, but more stable funding is definitely welcome, as everyone else has said. A serious community infrastructure push and clearer immigration planning, which we have been waiting to hear about. So we believe what we need now is delivery. So childcare spaces where women live, housing near jobs, and settlement and gender-based violence services funded to meet real-world demand. So we can't, while we are in a transition phase, we can't forget about what's already in our country and the needs that already exist. And we sit at the helm of intersectionality with immigrant and refugee women and girls. So, of course, how these good news areas of the budget are developed and delivered is a very important piece of how we help women thrive, because we all know that when women thrive, the whole city and the whole country will thrive. So ultimately, I think the budget does have indications in highlighting multi-year commitments, as I said, for women and gender equality, which is very welcome. Fewer arrivals and more economic class emphasis can raise the bar on language credentials, and this is good for matching talent to labor gaps, but there is a risk for equity here. Women caregivers, family class applicants, and gender-based violence survivors often have nonlinear work histories and face credential recognition hurdles. So service demand just doesn't fall in steps. Settlement, language, employment bridging, and violence prevention supports remain essential while these cohorts adjust. So it is really important that IRC continues, or that the settlement sector continues the cross-sector gender-based violence capacity building with settlement partners. And these are very, very unique services, especially when we're talking about gender supports. The big infrastructure and housing play big in the fiscal restraint elsewhere, and reset on immigration volumes is very important, as I said. But ultimately, I mean, when it comes to the supports, the demand won't drop just because the targets do. So cuts to temporary residence and lower permanent resident targets don't instantly shrink our caseloads, and women are already here and are in transitioning status as well. So we have to lean harder on language, employment, and legal navigation supports over a longer runway, because one of the biggest barriers for settlement to immigrant and refugee women and girls is navigating our system. So while we set up new systems and we streamline our supports, we need to make sure that the navigation of these systems is available to all of these vulnerable populations. The gender-based violence and wage funding provides stability. The multi-year envelopes help plan trauma-informed services. Cultural sensitivity is a big piece here that I think we can't forget about, and we're always working towards ensuring that all of the settlement supports for women are not just trauma-informed, but also culturally sensitive. And we need to work with mainstream, including, as was just mentioned, policing services to ensure that we have that cultural sensitivity in all of the services provided. We need to watch the timelines and cash flows to avoid any service cliffs and ensure that there is continuity. As I said, we already have the needs in our country. We can't afford to have our services just based on future planning. So, and in terms of childcare, I mean, with affordability moving, it's great to see that we're continuing with the $10 a day childcare. We have yet to see how this unfolds and continues to be implemented in different provinces. So having a little bit of stability in terms of national implementation plans would be very important. And housing, which is at the table stakes, is a table stakes issue. The infrastructure dollars must translate, we believe, into faster approvals and actual units near transit and jobs. So the planning of this is really important. So otherwise, settlement outcomes will stall. And it's important, once again, to track provincial and municipal agreements and ensure that things are ready to go, and we are not we're not in a pause mode between now and when we transition into the new implementation of services and programs. I think I will leave it at that, because I'm sure many others have more.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paula. With that, I'll hand it over to Faye.
Amazing. Thank you, Jenna, and thank you, everyone, and the organizers for hosting this. My name is Faye Johnstone. I'm the Executive Director of Career Momentum. We're a national 2SLGI+ advocacy organization working to support 2SLGI advocates and allies to build a Canada where freedom and equality are extended to everyone. And I'm just going to use my time to first paint the picture of how we got here. As folks would have seen, there was great concern when Prime Minister Carney unveiled his first budget, or his first cabinet, and there wasn't a wage minister. And many of the folks on this call, and women and girls and queer people across the country, advocated and were elated to see the return of a minister in the post-election cabinet. But it made us quite concerned that perhaps this Prime Minister wasn't as committed to gender equality as we would have hoped him to be. That's why we were extremely excited last week when there was a pledge of funding to sustain Women and Gender Equality Canada, inclusive of both funding for gender equality organizations, as well as funding, of course, for 2SLGI+ communities, for safety at Pride events, and well beyond. I think at this stage, I'm still concerned that investment in these kinds of programs are understood to be an expense rather than as an investment in Canada's future. If this is to be a truly generational budget, it has to work for women, for queer people, for trans people, because we as individuals and we as collective underpin a healthy and thriving society and a healthy and prosperous economy. Now, when it comes to areas of concern, first, I was disappointed that there wasn't more investment in 2SLGI+ entrepreneurship and workers. There's a lot of opportunity and a lot of barriers facing queer and trans folks in the job market and in developing a successful small business. And there were previous investments that were quite well received under the previous government. And we didn't see those continued, as far as I understand it, in this budget. There was also a reduction in Canada's global or international assistance by $2.7 billion over 5 years or over 4 years, including a decrease in development funding for global health. This, of course, comes as America is stepping backwards and as a lot of international assistance funding is becoming more and more scarce. I'm going to try to keep to time, and so I'll just end with a note of invitation. I think that there is tremendous opportunity in this budget, but it needs to be informed by and supported through the expertise of the organizations on this call and local queer, trans, and feminist organizations across this country. We need to ensure that they understand, this government understands, the integral and vital nature of the role that we play and the services that we offer. And without leaning into those investments and working with us and our sectors to make the most out of every dollar invested in this space, there will be a great lost opportunity, and we will see investments and approaches that don't reflect the realities on the ground for women and queer people from coast to coast to coast. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Faye. Over to Amanda.
Thank you, and hello, everyone. I'm Amanda Arella, National Director of Advocacy and Public Policy at YWCA Canada. We're the national voice for YWCAs working in 330 communities across the country to provide essential services to advance gender equity through shelters and housing, childcare, employment skills counseling, youth empowerment, and gender-based violence prevention and support work. This year's federal budget sends an important signal that investing in women and in gender equality is not only the right thing to do, it's smart economic policy. We know that when women thrive, communities and economies thrive. So the renewed investments we've seen for Women and Gender Equality Canada are a welcome step forward. This is something our movement has called for many years, and it's a necessary investment to eliminate discrimination and to advance the rights of women and gender diverse people. We've also seen real promise in the launch of Build Canada Homes. This is a historic opportunity to tackle Canada's housing crisis with the scale and urgency the moment demands. Investments in affordable and non-market housing are particularly vital for single-parent families, most of whom are led by single moms. We're ready to work with the federal government to ensure women and women-led families have safe, affordable, and long-term places to call home. But we also know that the work is far from done, because true gender equality isn't achieved through one-time programs or short-term funding for project work. It requires long-term investments in the social infrastructure that makes equality possible, the systems that allow women, girls, two-spirit, and gender diverse people to participate fully in our economy and in our society. That means continuing to strengthen Canada's affordable childcare system so that every family in every community has access to high quality and inclusive childcare. It means scaling up gender responsive housing solutions so that women and gender diverse people have safe and affordable places to live, places where they can rebuild, work, and lead. This budget's silence on these important items is a missed opportunity. And while we welcome commitments to end gender-based violence, there remains uncertainty around the future of the National Action Plan. At a time where gender-based violence has reached crisis levels, we need clarity on how these new investments will support measurable progress on safety and prevention. These are the foundations of generational change. At YWCA Canada, we see every day how deeply women's economic security is tied to access to care, to housing, to freedom from violence. And when we invest in those areas, we're not just helping individual women, we're building stronger, more resilient communities for everyone. So while we welcome this budget's progress, we're calling for sustained structural investments, the kind of investment that ensures equality isn't just promised, but delivered. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Over to you, Morna.
Thanks, Deanna. My name is Morna Ballantyne, and I serve as the Executive Director of Childcare Now, which is Canada's National Childcare Advocacy Association. In 2021, the Liberal government made a historic decision to build a universal early learning and childcare system, working in partnership with Indigenous governments and communities, with provinces and territories. The 2021 budget committed nearly $28 billion over 5 years and promised ongoing permanent funding beyond 25-26 at increased levels, recognizing that the Canada-wide Early Learning and Childcare program is a generational, economic, and social project. 4 years later, the results are meaningful, but far from complete. Licensed childcare for children aged 0 to 5 is now much more affordable, but only for those who are fortunate enough to find a program where and when they need it. More regulated spaces have opened, and 900,000 children are learning and being cared for in safe, high-quality environments. Educators have seen some progress on wages and working conditions. Women's labor force participation has risen, and growth in the early childhood sector has strengthened Canada's economy, helping the country avoid a technical recession in 2023. But the job isn't done. Progress is fragile, it's uneven, and it is at risk. Budget 2025, presented as a generational budget, does not increase annual childcare funding beyond what was announced last spring. And while that increase is important, it is insufficient to support system stability and growth, and that's a serious mistake. A much larger federal investment is urgently needed to expand the Canada-wide Early Learning and Childcare program to meet growing demand, to close the gender gap in labor force participation, to ensure that all children in every community can benefit from quality early learning and care, and to support worker mobility and access to jobs, and to strengthen Canada's short and long-term economic performance. We welcome Prime Minister Carney's commitment to protect affordable childcare for the 900,000 children currently enrolled. But that promise offers little reassurance to families who are on wait lists or live in communities with no licensed childcare. Without stronger federal support, many providers will struggle with rising costs and staff shortages, threatening the stability of the existing programs. We're also concerned that the lack of additional funding will make it harder to persuade Ontario, Alberta, and Saskatchewan to renew their $10 a day agreements. And without renewed funding, parent fees in those provinces will rise sharply after March 31st, 2026, only a few months from now. And the creation of new spaces could stall or reverse. So we urge the Government of Canada to honor its 2021 commitment by increasing childcare funding in Budget 2025 and working with Parliament to make $10 a day childcare accessible and sustainable for generations to come. We further urge the Government of Canada to reconsider any guardrails in the budget that could limit the expansion of social transfers to other levels of government in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Morna. Next, we have, sorry, I got distracted here. Karen.
Thanks so much, Deanna. It's a privilege to be in conversation with everyone here today. I'm Karen Campbell. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Vice President of Community Initiatives at the Canadian Women's Foundation. We were pleased to host a conversation in August with 22 national feminist organizations, many online with us today, where we shared with Minister Valdez the importance of funding continuity for gender equality work in Canada. This year's budget offered some much needed relief for the women's and gender justice sector through the confirmation of $660 million in ongoing funding for the Department of Women and Gender Equality. And this is critical to the work that we all are doing every day. As we know, wage funding keeps shelters, crisis lines, and youth programs operating. It sustains national advocacy and research. It supports organizations tackling gender-based violence, economic inequality, and systemic barriers that we are all facing. Wage funding gives us the stability to plan, respond, and lead, not just react to crisis after crisis. The inclusion of $76 million in permanent funding for the women's program is an important step for the department, although we know that there are no quick fixes to the challenges we face in the sector or for the root causes of the issues we work on every day. At the Canadian Women's Foundation, we see how great this need is. Across all our granting programs last year, we were able to only fund 7% of applications, And for programs addressing gender-based violence specifically, which are by far in the most demand, that number drops to just 3%. Those figures tell us a clear story. Even with this investment, the sector remains stretched to its limits. Through solid investments in urgent priorities like housing and gender-based violence prevention, Budget 2025 takes positive steps towards addressing the needs of women and gender diverse people in Canada, especially amid rising levels of violence and insecurity. However, as colleagues today have rightly noted, it's important to make sure that no one is left behind. Criminalized women, immigrant, refugee, and precarious status migrant women, Indigenous women, disabled women, 2S LGBTQIA+ communities, and those living at multiple intersections. This budget also falls short on accountability. We still need concrete measures to ensure follow-through, such as establishing a GBV commissioner to monitor and publicly report on the implementation of the National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence and the federal GBV strategy. Without accountability, progress to address the violence we experience can fade between budget cycles. We're also watching closely for the full release of the promised youth mental health funding. Rising mental health challenges among girls, trans, and non-binary youth are deeply connected to safety, well-being, and inclusion. Community organizations are ready to deliver that support and hope that funds flow quickly and equitably. For generational change, we need to look beyond wage. We need a whole of government approach. Gender equality isn't the responsibility of one department. It must run through housing, health, immigration, employment, and economic policy. When budgets tighten, women and gender diverse people, particularly those experiencing multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination every day, are the first to lose ground. Investing in the women's rights and gender justice movement isn't a niche concern. It's nation building. When women and gender diverse people are safe, housed, and supported, they can participate fully in the economy. When organizations have the resources to deliver services and shape policy, we build stronger, fairer communities for everyone. Budget 2025 shows some progress and proof that advocacy works, but it also reminds us that the work isn't done. We need sustained, accountable, multi-year funding and a feminist lens across every department so that gender justice becomes a permanent priority, not an exceptional one. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Over to you, Stefania.
Thank you so much. My name is Stefania Secha. I'm the Executive Director of Advocacy and Public Affairs at the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. I just wanted to say I stand in solidarity with the panelists who've spoken before me and for those who come after. A next generation plan that invests in our future must account for the unique housing needs of women, two-spirit, trans, and gender diverse people, including Indigenous and racialized populations, newcomers and refugees, people with disabilities, and our aging population and youth. An ambitious generational budget breaks the intergenerational cycles that otherwise reproduce homelessness and housing insecurity. The government's significant capital for Build Canada Homes indicates a serious commitment to increasing the housing supply. And we also celebrate the investment for wage that was hard fought and shows that gender equality is being recognized as essential infrastructure. These investments are critical opportunities to address the issue and are real steps forward. But if this government is as serious as we hope it is about shaping the next generation, then women, two-spirit, trans, and gender diverse people must be a priority in the budget. Yet they remain invisible in the federal housing plan beyond mentions of shelter and transitional housing investments. We must build homes that are not only deeply affordable, but also accessible for women and gender diverse people with disabilities and for seniors who deserve an age and dignity. Gender neutral housing policy is never neutral. It reproduces inequity and leaves the majority of those in core housing need behind. Later this month, the National Housing Council's NAHA review panel will release its recommendations on Canada's duty to uphold the right to housing for women and gender diverse people. These upcoming recommendations to the Minister of Housing will offer an evidence-based blueprint to address the housing equity gap, but only if the government commits to them. If federal dollars are not guided by gender, accessibility, and Indigenous rights, then Budget 2025 risks spending billions on building units that will not reach those with the least access today. Canada cannot build its way out of this crisis without building differently and ensuring housing is purpose-built to address the unique family structures and affordability realities of this country's most vulnerable households. For WIN, our priorities remain unchanged and urgent. We have called for an enhanced gender-based analysis plus framework rooted in Indigenous knowledge and principles and specific to housing development in collaboration with community partners and people with lived experience of housing insecurity. This framework must guide and inform all federal housing investments and decision-making to ensure equitable outcomes. We've also called for an allocation of at least 40% of affordable and deeply affordable housing units for women, two-spirit, trans, and gender diverse people, and for the government to commit $50 million annually over 8 years to create an Indigenous governed gendered homelessness stream within Reaching Home. Budget 2025 must also fund Indigenous governed housing infrastructure. It must commit to sustained multi-year core funding for the urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing strategy. We heard Finance Minister Francois Philippe Champagne call Budget 2025 the most ambitious housing plan since the Second World War. But ambitious for whom? This was not historically an era of fairness or equity for women, especially not Indigenous women, racialized women, single mothers, or the 2S LGBTQIA+ communities. We cannot retrofit equality into frameworks that were not built for us. And a truly next generation housing plan must build equity in from the start and be unprecedented in its own right. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to you, Michelle.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Biss, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Right to Housing Network. I use the pronoun she, her. I want to start by recognizing that housing was, of course, a major focus of this budget, and we support the federal government's commitment to $13 billion for Build Canada Homes. We were also pleased to see that a commitment to non-market housing was reiterated in the budget, which we are assuming will mean social housing, community housing, nonprofit housing, cooperative housing, supportive housing, transitional housing. Colleagues across the housing sector are still digging into the math of what this housing investment will actually mean. But the problem is, especially with Build Canada Homes, we're missing clarity on whether or not the entity is going to take the outcomes-based approach that the National Housing Council and the Federal Housing Advocate have been calling for. So critically, for example, we're missing clarity on what the definition of affordability will be used for that affordable housing that is being built. We are supporting the call to action for this to be an income-based target. We are also still hoping for clarity on the target and proportion of the housing built through Build Canada Homes that will be community housing. Will it be all of the housing built with that $13 billion, or will it be a much smaller portion? We need some clarity on that as well. We're also supporting many of our colleagues across the housing justice sector and asking for some clarity on what the target is for Indigenous-led community housing. And really critically, another piece that was missing from this housing budget was a target and timeline on when Canada will commit to ending homelessness as an urgent human rights obligation. We know that women and gender diverse persons, particularly women with disabilities, are heavily impacted by core housing need and homelessness in Canada. And I will note as well that deeply concerning to me is that the language in the budget in relationship to housing seemed departure from the 2024 federal budget where the Renter Bill of Rights was introduced. Because the problem is, if we are pouring money into this investment in affordable housing, this $13 billion for Build Canada Homes, it's like filling up a bathtub, but we've left the plug open if we are not all sections and making sure that existing housing stock is protected. We look forward to working with the federal government as they work on the rollout of the previously introduced Renter Bill of Rights, as well as the design of Build Canada Homes, which we are hopeful is going to make a deep impact in genuinely ending homelessness in the country and addressing Canada's housing crisis.
Great. And with that, we'll hand it over to our last speaker, Catherine.
Thanks so much, Deanna, and thanks everyone. It's been a tremendous hour, and I always learn so much from this and my colleagues, and just really, truly appreciate the opportunity to speak about yesterday's budget. The Liberals presented a budget, obviously, yesterday that, in their words, they say will make generational investments in housing, infrastructure, defense, productivity, and competitiveness that will allow us to meet the moment. The single biggest line item in yesterday's budget was a 56.6 billion investment in the Canadian Armed Forces. The second largest was the middle class income tax cut that was passed last June. Billions more were set aside to catalyze private sector investment, including 1.5 billion in tax measures, 12 billion to protect and reorient strategic industrial sectors, and 4.4 billion toward expanding trade. These measures are, in part, largely to be financed by 60 billion in cuts to programs and jobs over the next 5 years. So the budget sets out a vision for the future, but as we've been discussing today, the question is whose future? The millions now struggling to pay their rent and put food on the table were looking for relief in budget 2025, and they were disappointed. In his hunt for billions in defense dollars, Prime Minister Carney's chosen to follow a neoliberal playbook, shrinking government, cutting taxes, and leaving more to the private sector, an approach that's been shown time and again to lead to greater inequality, limited opportunity, and reduced prosperity. At a time when poverty is rising and the gap between the rich and the rest of us is growing, this government missed an opportunity to deliver on a budget that lifts up all Canadians. Moreover, it's reinforcing a narrative that being peddled by business elites, that governments are an obstacle to prosperity, that social programs are a drain on the economy, that natural resources and manufacturing, largely bastions of male employment, are the only sectors that count. Pending federal job cuts certainly deliver the message to everyone that federal workers don't count, and that it's important to note that a majority of these cuts will be disproportionately borne by women and equity-seeking groups. As the other panelists have noted, the federal government's plan to cut 57 billion in programs over the next 5 years, but they didn't campaign on these deep cuts. Indeed, it's 40% higher than what was proposed in the spring budget, in their spring budget platform. These are massive cuts, and they will be felt by Canadians of all stripes as programs disappear. And of course, there's much that we don't know. Folks have been talking about that this morning on the call. We don't have details by department about which programs will be targeted to be eliminated. So clearly there are winners and losers in the budget. I noticed in the chat that someone was asking about climate. This is a key critical feminist issue. Certainly the foreign fossil fuel investors were big winners in this budget, and Canada's climate, a big loser. There's a new climate competitiveness strategy, which is really climate in name only. No new spending has been directed toward emissions reduction programs, and at least 3 billion in existing climate programs are to be cut as part of the broader public service reduction exercise, including public monies for public transit. As my colleague Hadrian Merton Kirkwood wrote yesterday, quote, "In many respects, this is the most harmful budget from a climate perspective since the Harper era. There is also resounding silence on poverty reduction. Keyword search showed that poverty appeared only 10 times, 8 of which were at the back of the budget in their impact report, which noted time and again that many of the new measures being proposed were actually regressive. We know, for instance, and as Morna has pointed out, there was resounding silence on childcare. No word about pharmacare and the extension of the monies needed to complete the provision of the pharmacare plan, including free birth control and so forth. Little mention of healthcare outside of infrastructure spends in the hospital sector. No concern or word about income security, which is critical, and a host of other vital programs, including those impacting gender-based violence and the like, all of which are crucial to women's rights and equality. So I wanted to just briefly conclude by saying much today in the newspapers is being made of the 78.3 billion deficit that will be recorded this next year. But it's important to remember that Canada is well able to shoulder these expenses. For context, the federal government ran deficits 2 to 4 times this size most of the way through the 1970s to the 1990s compared to the size of our economy. And we always have to remember that if the federal government has a deficit, it means that some other sector has a surplus. And in this case, the surplus is being created for high-income households and large foreign-owned companies benefiting from defense spending and oil and gas. Didn't have to be like this. Budgets are about making choices. The government could have provided more support for unemployed workers through EI or strengthened our social infrastructure as we've been talking about. It could have made the investments needed to secure a truly national and affordable childcare system so critically needed. Could have made other expenses as we've been talking about this morning. Could have raised taxes on the rich to actually bolster a truly inclusive economy. So I'll leave it there. We'll see if the budget survives. I mean, obviously it's now down to getting it through Parliament. But I think there's much work. This budget was a missed opportunity. There's much work ahead for progressives to continue our work to build the country we need and the country we want. Thanks, Diana, back to you.
Thanks so much, everyone. We're already over time, so we're unfortunately don't have time to take question and answers at this point. However, we try to answer as many as possible in writing in the chat. But thank you so much for tuning in. It has been such a rich source of information and analysis coming from everyone on a whole lot of different issues. We've pasted all of the speakers and their organizations in the chat, and feel free to, check out their websites where you'll probably find further analysis on the budget. But with that, thank you so much for joining us, and bye-bye.
Bye.